Thank you, Tara. And hello, everybody, and welcome, and thanks for showing up here. Today, I'm going to talk about a little bit of background to the project objectives. The output is going to be in 3 phases, all about aggregation harvesting, and then a quick summary. So I'm just going to start off with who the Healthy Landscapes program is. And we are actually, the membership includes all of the forest management companies in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and a couple in BC, the 3 governments of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and Ducks Unlimited. We've been operating for, wow, I guess about 25 years now under different names. And our mandate hasn't really changed much: to understand ecosystem patterns and processes, and then help partners explore how to use that knowledge towards creating healthier landscapes. And we're going to see a bit of both of those today in this presentation. So here's the 30-second tour of the theory of NRV strategy. The idea is not a new idea, that the further you deviate from natural patterns, the greater the biological risk, the lower the probability of being fully sustainable. And by fully sustainable, I mean the ecosystem and all of its services, not timber harvesting, not habitat, but all of the services, and landscape health and resilience. So within that, the project objective in this case is to obtain a better understanding if, or to what degree, aggregated harvesting activities is possible, and the potential impacts on ecosystem health and caribou habitat. And I'll get to the relationship between those two in a few slides here. So first part is why aggregation, and why is the Healthy Landscapes program interested in aggregation? Well, the underlying assumption of a coarse-filter or an NRV strategy, it's often called a coarse-filter strategy, assumes we understand and integrate knowledge of natural patterns at all spatial and temporal scales. So we started asking this question: is this actually true at intermediate, or what I call a meso-scale? And I think in some cases people think, well, we have fire size. Isn't that what fire size is supposed to do? If we compare fire size maximum numbers to the area burned by fire size, and in this case I just used Alberta, but these numbers are very similar for anywhere in the boreal. We can see that the vast majority of the fires are very, very large. So even at 10,000 hectares, which is the limit for Ontario, still 82% of the area that's burned happens in fires that are larger than that 10,000 hectares. And 10,000 hectares is high for a maximum threshold across Canada. It can be down as low as 3,000 hectares, and you can see we're down at 98% of the area burned or in events larger than 3,000 hectares. So it's not really capturing maximum fire size here. And really what's going on is that we're not asking the right question. We're talking about individual fire events, and those events can burn. You can get 100,000 hectare fire that burns in a couple of weeks or a month. That would take us decades to harvest. So let's change the time and space scales and ask a different question. This is a map of the cumulative fire activity over a 20-year period in 10,000 hectare cells. So what we're seeing here is the dark red are areas that are most of the areas burned, greater than 75%, and the areas that are light red, they didn't burn at all. So this is equivalent to sort of, think of a compartment in timber harvesting. So this is what fires do. They cluster. They naturally cluster at this scale. And I'm only showing you one snapshot, but there are actually several, and they all show the same thing. And here is what NRV looks like. Here's the frequency distribution of that map. So zero, the cells with zero are like it's more than a third of the cells have no fire activity. And this is a landscape that has a fairly high level of fire activity. The fire cycle there is around 65 years. So lots of fire activity, and over 20 years, you still have a third of the cells that have zero, and then there's a distribution. So we've got NRV, we've got a new meso-scale indicator potentially. So how does this compare to what we do? I'm only going to show you one graph like this, but I will say that I've done this for several different landscapes and FMA areas, and they all look similar. So what we do with our harvesting activity is it gets spread out. And you can see that there's no cells with zero, and there's no cells more than about 50% that are disturbed. And there are several reasons for that, but the bottom line is this is not about how much disturbance there is. It's about when and where they are. So there's a big difference here between how Mother Nature is doing wildfire patterns and how we're doing our own anthropogenic activities. And I just mocked up something here to demonstrate that, and it's just a toy. But on the left is what we've been doing. And even imagine this is like a 10,000 hectare event. So some of those are fairly large. They can be in the thousands of hectares. But on the right is what Mother Nature does. And I exaggerated here a bit to make my point. But what's happening here is that there is no control. We may have fire size, but there's a maximum limit to it. And there's no control over where those events go. So without any reason not to do it, we space them out. And in terms of a healthy landscape, the one on the left has less interior forest. It has more edge, fewer large contiguous areas. It's a less diverse and less resilient landscape, which means it's more susceptible to wildfire, insects, and disease. It's not a healthy landscape, but it's also not particularly caribou friendly. And this is where the two worlds collide, the coarse filter and the fine filter. And I think this is interesting that the Healthy Landscapes program came at this issue from an ecosystem health perspective, and it was the arckp and that committee that came at this from a caribou perspective. So that was one of the really exciting parts of this project. So back to this question, is this true at intermediate scales? No, it's not. We're missing a pretty important natural pattern here. So aggregation tools, we've got some new indicators, some new strategies, and some new model tools. And I'm just going to go over those really quickly. So in terms of ecological indicators, these are the number 3 isn't particularly, road density is not new. What's new about this is that it's the percentage of cells. Okay, the percentage of cells, and in this case, 10,000 hectares. And I'm really only going to focus here on the extremes. We don't need to do a fancy frequency distribution. If we capture the number of cells with zero disturbance, that's going to give us a pretty good idea of how we're distributing disturbance in terms of whether it's clustered or whether it's uniform. Right now, remember back to this one, that zero, we're not representing it very well. So, and then the second one will be the cells with lots of old forest. This is ultimately where we want to go. And if we cluster disturbance activities, the other end of it means we're going to get clusters of large patches of older forest. And then the number of cells was, and we've got NRV for both of those, for 1 and for 2, we've got a natural range of variation. And then for number 3, we capture road density, but what we really want to capture is the number of cells that don't have any roads or have a small proportion of roads in them. If we're everywhere all the time, it means we have roads everywhere all the time. So this is another indicator that I added. New strategies. We tested 5. I'm only going to talk about one of them here. This is a WHERE-WYN strategy, which is something I made up a couple of years ago. Where is where you are, and that's the aggregation part, okay? That's where you cluster, where you focus activities. You use existing footprint and other values to identify it. The location or the duration could be anywhere between 5 and 10 years, as long as it takes for you to go in and harvest the wood in there. And it is going to be a substantial area, somewhere in the neighborhood of thousands of hectares, and you can integrate prescribed fire in it as well. The WYNs is a where you're not. This is what we don't do right now, and it's the equivalent of a temporal deferral zone. It's not a park, it's not an area that's set aside. It just means you're not going to go in there for anywhere from 10, 20, up to 40 years. And again, a substantial area. This also comes from NRV, and you can put these in areas, for example, in caribou zones, depending on other values. And the disturbance tools here are avoidance, obviously, you're not disturbing, but there are also places where you could strategically do linear feature restoration. So this is what it looks like, and this is actually from another project that I'm working on actually in BC, but this is an actual map of areas where the WHEREs in the blue, and you can see they're different sizes and different shapes. They're not necessarily square cells. And then the WYNs, the temporal deferral zones, in the yellow. Okay, the third part of it is a new Patchworks tool. So a large part of this project was actually creating what we're calling a compartment tool. And it's a second layer or second level of aggregation, which means there's two scales of clustering going on now, not just one. The added bonus for this is that actually the model runs up to 20 times faster with this tool, which is a bonus because it means you can test more scenarios, which we did. So why a second tool? Well, when we talk about aggregation, we tend to have this idea in our mind that if we want to, there's going to be polygons that are going to be adjacent to each other and we can get really compact. This is an example from Northern Ontario, and believe it or not, it's almost the same area disturbed in both of these images. But they had a landscape where it was fairly consistent merchantable forest, so this was easy. The reality is this is more like what it looks like. So our ability to cluster is limited because we just don't have a lot of landscapes where there's merchantable wood in thousands of hectares next to each other. So you get clusters, and they're too far apart to be the same event. And so the model's not going to gather them in that way. So the clustering tool allows for that second layer. So everything and that one on the right would be gathered together and called into aggregation. But there's actually two levels of aggregation going on there. So the third and last part of it was simulating this. And we did this using Patchworks, which is a scenario planning tool, probably one, if not the most popular one in Alberta and probably Canada, and worked directly with Tom Moore, who was the architect of Patchworks. So I'm going to show you the new indicators and the new tools, and we're going to do some testing. We use 3 study areas, each one of which has at least one caribou range within it: Chinchaga, Wandering River on the Alpac FMA, and the Burland. I'm not going to show you results for all of these. We ran about 65 scenarios, and Tom, as a part of his modeling, ran another 25. There's no way I could show you all of them. But this, what I will show you is how the new indicators are going to work. So you can see here that this is the business as usual scenario, which was just no clustering, all of the existing rules. We didn't, just as a baseline. And so here's the ecological indicators. Number 1 are the ones with, I didn't use 0. I actually used less than 2% of young, and I did it at 10 and 50 and 100 years to look at trends. So that's the first indicator. Second indicator I talked about was amount of old forest there, and there was a lot of them in a cell. And I used 50 and 100 years. That's the outline in blue. And then the road density one is in green. The number of, remember, that's the proportion of cells that have 0 new roads in them. The other set of indicators I didn't talk about that's new to this project were actually product mix. And we did large and small saw logs because aggregation is very well, we know it's going to have an impact on product mix, because if you're in there and you've got equipment and you've got the people and roads, you're probably going to lower your merchantability limits, and you can take wood out that's down to maybe 100 cubes per hectare, which you wouldn't otherwise do because it doesn't pay. So we wanted to track the product mix. So this is what it looks like in terms of, in the final report, you'll see this layout. So the first test that I'm going to show you is just the compartment tool. Does the compartment tool work? Does it help create landscapes that are closer to something more natural and better than business as usual? I'm only going to show you the results here from the Chinchaga. And so the scenario number 11 was patches between 500 and 5,000 hectares with no compartments. And you can see what happened is we drop right down to the economic indicators. The amount of wood that was harvested, including all the product mix, dropped significantly. And this is fairly consistent with what other people have found and a previous study that Forecourt did on aggregated harvesting. The more you try to aggregate by clustering patches, the less wood the model is finding. The reason I highlighted the economic indicators for number 11 in orange is that they all look really good, right, compared to business as usual, but it's because we're not harvesting much wood, right? So it's not a great trade-off. Now, with exactly the same scenario, the only other thing we did is we added in the compartment tool and told it to find compartments of 1.5 to 2,500 hectares, and then they get grouped by patches. You can see every single ecological indicator improves, and the amount of wood that comes out, and I'm not a planning forester, but they're not bad, right? And someone else can correct me, but it's a whole lot better than just patches by itself. So for me, this was a big check mark. Is like, okay, patches and compartments together are better. And you can see actually, even with the amount of wood that's harvested, the total kilometers of road, is less than half. So a good one there. Now I'm going to, in this case, I'm going to show you some scenarios that we compared together. And I just put together, what we tested was 3 different sizes of patches, none, small, medium, and large. And I can talk about what sizes they are, if you want to know. And then 2 different compartment sizes, small and medium. And just to see, and I only narrowed this down to 3 ecological indicators and 3 economic indicators. And the number of check marks or X's and the shade, and the darker the shade, the more it deviated from the business as usual scenario. So the pattern that you're seeing here is that the ones that are the least popular in terms of economic look the best in terms of ecological, and that's fairly consistent across the board. But you can also see that there's a lot of variation here between the different scenarios, which I think is really interesting. So it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. But this is for the Burland. Now, the Burland is the landscape that has the greatest amount of operable forest and merchantable forest. So it can cluster better than the other 2 study areas. Here's the Wandering River in the Alpac FMA, and you can see the difference between them in terms of, in particular, the darkest shades of red and the darkest shades of green. Again, there's a direct relationship between the 2, but the Wandering River, even with the compartment, even though it did better with compartment than just patches alone, still had trouble finding a viable solution for clustering. I'm going to get back to this because I think it's unfinished business, but I just wanted to point out the difference between those two landscapes. The Wandering River has only 32% operating forest, which is less than half of that from the Burland. And there's the difference. So we still manipulated other things in the model in terms of patch size. And I'm only going to show you 2 of the strategies that we tested here. Number 1 is that we zoned the landscape. We used the Caribou ranges and outside. And in this case, for example, we did the aggregated harvesting inside the Caribou range and allowed it to have, there was business as usual outside. So patch sizes weren't relevant. It could just go find wood. Inside the Caribou range, as you can imagine, much better ecologically. and especially for Wandering River. So this was a game changer for Wandering River. Inside the Caribou range looked really good. And economically, it was almost as much wood as the business as usual. So this improved the Wandering River scenario tremendously. The problem is, outside the Caribou ranges, it was much worse ecologically. And here's what's happening, again, in my little toy version. The Caribou range is that circle on the left there, and there's large, I just made it up, put 4 very large disturbance activities in there, and then business as usual outside. So that exaggeration of the interior forest area and the amount of edge and the amount of roads required on the outside, it's actually declining. So, which raises a really interesting question, because it really does almost put up a fence. And like if you're going to get a fire in this caribou zone, where are they going to go? Because the ecological conditions outside are only going to deteriorate. They're not getting any better, and they're not very caribou friendly. So I thought this was a really interesting result. Strategy number 2, the last one I'm going to talk about, the wheres and wyns. So far we're only talking about wheres, right? We're only talking about where you're going to put aggregation. What we tried next is to create some wyns. So we actually had to manually put them in the model and say, you're not going to harvest here for, I think we said 40 years. And we only did 1 round of it, but the results were really encouraging for the Burland and the Chinchaga. And I'll show you some of that. So actually, the results were better for both ecologically and economically, and not so much for Wandering River. And here's what that looks like in terms of that chart again. So you compare, so what we're comparing here is exactly the same scenario for Chinchaga, without a WYN in the gray, and then with the WYN in the blue on the right-hand side. And you can see that most of the ecological indicators actually got better. Okay, the amount of cells, we're clustering old forest. The amount of young forest in terms of 0 it was almost a wash. It might have been a decline by a little bit, but the clustering of older forest was far better. And take a look at the economic indicators. So we're actually almost at the business as usual. And this was just, I'm going to say, a very, very simplified version of a WYN, but it was really encouraging. And that's all I have time to talk about. So in summary, this project focused on 3 things. We got some new knowledge, understanding that wildfires cluster at multiple scales and at meso-scales. And we've created some NRV data that is available. And there's a publication as a part of this project that's available now that describes all of that. It's easy to use. Those indicators don't exist right now. The best we have are things like interior forest, which is challenging to use in a model, and it's sort of debatable, how you're going to use it. So we've got a new set of indicators that can be used right in the model. And they're actually integrated right now into Patchworks. We've got some new strategies. I only talked about a couple of them. And we've got a new compartment tool in Patchworks. From the scenario output, what we did learn is that we can aggregate. It's possible. And I'm going to say so far 2 out of 3 of the study areas without significant economic costs. But I think we do what we haven't fully explored is what's going on with Wandering River, because I think there's opportunities there. But the solutions are landscape specific. And I think, the rest of it, we would be nice we pushed as far as we could here in terms of our, our time and our budget. It'd be nice to have done more. But there's, I think, still some work to be done. So in the end, ecosystem health, coarse-filter, NRV, and caribou can live together, right? They align. And again, I think this is a really interesting finding. But I think what we have to realize is that aggregation is a bit more complicated than we're imagining right now. It does exist on multi-scales, and it is multidimensional. That the fact that it's happening at several scales in the model. And then when we sort of created that tool, it's a big step forward. And just in terms of practitioners, if we're going to continue on what I'm calling, an EBM journey using an NRV strategy, we need to start managing at these intermediate scales. Right now, we're not. There is nothing in management planning. There's nothing in the models that require this. We've got the tools. We've got most of the tools. We've got knowledge. We've got some new strategies. We've got indicators. So this is all possible now. And with that, I will thank the funding partners, arckp, Sakowski, and Alpac, and Tom Moore in particular, because he did donate quite a bit of his time to create the new compartment tool. Tom and I have been working on versions of this idea of the WHERE-WYN for almost 10 years now. So it was, I think he'd been thinking about how to do this in Patchworks for a long time. And with that, I guess I'm all done. Thanks.